You could.
So, I want to start today with that reading from Luke, because for a parable, it's pretty direct. When one reads it and studies it, even casually, two messages rise naturally from it. One of these messages has to do with prayer, and the other has to do with justice. Prayer and justice, which to an American might come off as a strange combination when we think about it. One of our bedrock beliefs in this country is the separation of church and state. And while we certainly don't have to do this, in the dominant mainstream culture, it has become second nature to us to take those things that are meant to drive our lives. Those things that are meant to drive our lives, namely our beliefs, religious, relational, spiritual beliefs, and internalize them as much as possible, making them matters of the heart, to keep them inside, restricting them for the time set aside for ritual, for meditation, and for worship. And then we are meant to fill that remaining space, particularly out in public, with a much more pragmatic, rational, self-contained, and self-interested worldview, to hold in our highest dreams and aspirations for the future, to hold them close to ourselves, lest we seem eccentric or radical or an untrustworthy nonconformist to the outside world. As we plan or campaign or vote for our vision of a just society and our place in it, we expect or are expected to compromise, mostly, to keep achievable goals for ourselves and others, rather than to dream the big dreams of the commonwealth of heaven. And that's why I love this parable. It gives us nowhere to hide. It is, in fact, a confrontation in a few short verses between the ideals of our hearts and the so-called practical world we live in. This woman, she goes to the unjust judge, and says, "Grant me justice against my opponent." But the judge is busy, right? The judge is too busy with schemes of his own, and he puts her off. He waves her away. Why should he, a great and powerful politician, take any time off to hear the concerns of someone else? A woman who has been wronged, possibly by someone just as unjust as he is. But in the story, she persisted. She came back and back and back again. "Grant me justice," she said. She persisted, and after a long time and many trials, she won. Through faith and action. As William Schultz, past president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, writes, "Religion and justice are born on each other's wings." Religion and justice are born on each other's wings. Now, the unjust judge, if you listen to this story, the unjust judge clearly wasn't won over to her side. The scales didn't fall from his eyes. Instead, he did the right thing because he was forced to. Her activity made him acknowledge the legitimacy of her case, as well as her right to bring that case. That is, he had to see her. He had to recognize her humanity and the humanity of those she represented. But he didn't have to like it. Now, often this parable is also presented as a funny story about the importance of a regular prayer life. In one reading, the story is there to remind us that in the midst of the secular world, we need to find ways to connect with the spiritual one, to energize, refresh, and refuel ourselves, to bang relentlessly on the gates of heaven. And it works pretty well that way, too. The image of billions of people petitioning a grumpy Judeo-Christian God is compelling and entertaining. But it's important to remember. It's important to remember that Jesus here isn't making an equivalency between that unjust judge and God. According to pastor and theologian Reverend Cynthia Hale, we do not have to beg God for anything. God, she says, is more likely to bless us than we are to ask. But I have to say that Jesus seems more than a little too optimistic about how that asking for justice will go. I tell you, he says, God will quickly grant justice. God will quickly grant justice. But that isn't how it feels today, or even most days, because we don't live in God's world, in that commonwealth of heaven. The world we live in is full of unjust judges, and in ways too numerous to recount in full, sometimes, maybe this time, it feels like they are winning. In our reading from Andrew Sean Greer today, he contrasts the joy he felt at the passage of the Defense of Marriage Act with the struggles that have followed. I think we were so tired of fighting, he writes. It felt good at last to win. But the last few years have proven that we can't stop fighting. We can't stop fighting. We cannot stop demanding justice. The unjust judge, you see, will give us just enough to make us go away. True and full justice is never really on the table for them. So the question for us is, when we read this as a justice parable, the question is, how do we make sure that we do not ever go away? How do we be like this woman in the story? How do we persist in the face of injustice? How do we keep ourselves on that road when there are so many ways to step off? How do we do that? Well, it's a good thing that this is also a parable about prayer. For prayer and meditation, or rather the connection to the divine, or whatever we want to call what we conceive of as greater than ourselves, that intentional connection is what sustains us when we are weary and sick at heart, when the struggle has gotten us down. Jesus, in this parable that he's telling, is clearly talking about prayer in relation to God. But I don't think that belief in a clearly articulated power is necessary to gain the benefits of the discipline of prayer. In this parable, it is all about the woman. She puts in the effort and gains the reward. She has the clarity of vision that comes from within. However, she's not granted that clarity from some higher power. She makes it herself. We don't have to believe in God to pray. We just need to be capable of caring. We need to be capable of caring. And without that connection, without that caring, we can end up being the unjust judge. We can be the unjust judge just as quickly as the other way around. And sometimes we do it out of what we perceive as the goodness of our hearts. In one of the churches that I served before coming to Eliot, we used a covenant arranged by the Universalist minister L. Griswold Williams. You can actually find it in the gray hymnal right above our own. And it began by saying, love is the doctrine of this church, the quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. Service is its prayer. In our tradition, service itself can be a prayer. In fact, advocacy and caring for others is a legitimate and well-worn path toward enlightenment and better understanding in many faiths. Justice and prayer are inextricably linked that way. If we wish to seek and be sustained by a greater vision, we are compelled to work for that vision. It just makes sense that way, doesn't it? We are compelled to immerse ourselves in it, giving of ourselves and receiving from others even as we give. That said, to serve prayerfully requires a certain attitude and approach. It isn't just helping people. Many times those of us with a little bit of power will do things for others. Right? I know I have. Risking no more than the judge does, yet expecting some recognition for our contributions in return. In the process of prayerful service, we have to give up that power as we walk with our fellow human beings. Otherwise, we are no better than the unjust judge who ultimately does the right thing for the wrong reasons. In prayerful service, we must have humility. Humility. William Schultz tells us that in the heart of every stranger lurks a reflection of our own. Seeing our shared connection, setting aside what we often see as our own ample qualifications, giving up any privileged place we might hold to walk with another as equals, as fellow travelers on the paths of life. This is prayer through service. It helps us to see the heart of the stranger and our own heart through them. You know what? When we do this, when we really do this, we are not drained by this process. Though our egos may fight it, we are not drained. We are renewed by what we share. The Unitarian Universalist minister, Reverend Marjorie Bowens-Wheatley, reminds us in our reading today that if we join spirits as brothers and sisters, the pain of our aloneness will be lessened. In the Spirit, she says, we build community and restoration. And we do, or we can. Because this prayerful humility leads also to empathy, to seeing someone else's suffering. Maybe not understanding it entirely, but understanding its validity in a way that the unjust judge never will. Empathy keeps us from wallowing in our own pain or focusing on the barriers that we have overcome. Instead, we can look back at our own trials and use them to better understand and experience the trials of others. Michael Eric Dyson addresses this in Tears We Cannot Stop, saying that empathy must be cultivated. Empathy, he says, must be cultivated. Do not tell us how we should act if we were you, he says. Imagine how you would act if you were us. It sounds simple, he says, but its benefits are profound. In a world where so many people cry out for justice, let us find ways to make a practice, not of judging, nor of fixing things for others, but instead of seeing ourselves in the midst of all creation and crying out for justice together. Amen.